The air was heavy with summer heat as Ethan found himself alone with Michael once again. Olivia had left for a weekend yoga retreat, entrusting the two men with keeping the house in order. Ethan had planned to spend the time reading and staying out of Michael's way, but the house felt suffocating, its quiet amplifying every errant thought and lingering glance. It was Michael who broke the silence that evening, suggesting they watch a movie. "Nothing serious," he said, grabbing a bottle of wine from the kitchen. "Something to pass the time?" Ethan hesitated, but eventually nodded. The idea of companionship, even under these fraught circumstances, was too tempting to resist. They settled into the living room, a comfortable distance apart, as the movie began. At first, the interaction felt safe, ordinary. They laughed at the film's cheesy dialogue, passing the bottle of wine back and forth. But as the night wore on, the space between them seemed to shrink. When Michael leaned forward to refill his glass, his hand brushed against Ethan's knee. The contact was brief but electric, sending a shockwave through Ethan's body. He froze, unsure if it had been accidental or deliberate, but Michael didn't pull away immediately. "Sorry," Michael murmured, his voice low, almost tentative. "It's fine," Ethan replied, though his voice betrayed him with a slight tremor. They returned to watching the movie, but the mood had shifted. Ethan was acutely aware of Michael's proximity, the warmth radiating from his body, the subtle scent of his cologne. His mind raced with conflicting emotions, desire, guilt, and a growing inability to resist the pull he felt toward this man. The credits rolled, but neither of them moved. The silence between them grew thick, charged with unspoken tension. Finally, Michael spoke. "Ethan, he trailed off, running a hand through his hair. "I don't want to make you uncomfortable, but I can't ignore what's happening here." Ethan's heart pounded. He wanted to deny it, to pretend he didn't understand, but the look in Michael's eyes left no room for pretense. "I don't know what you mean," Ethan lied, his voice barely audible. Michael leaned closer, his gaze steady and searching. "Yes, you do." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Ethan felt his resolve crumbling, the weight of his own desires pressing down on him. "This is wrong," he whispered, though the conviction in his voice was weak. Michael nodded slowly. "It is. But that doesn't change the way I feel." Ethan looked away, his thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and longing. "What about Olivia?" he asked, his voice cracking. "She doesn't deserve this," Michael admitted, his tone heavy with guilt. "But I can't pretend anymore. Not with you." The raw honesty in Michael's voice struck a chord in Ethan. He had spent so much of his life hiding, denying his own feelings, that the idea of someone acknowledging them, despite the circumstances, felt intoxicating. Before he could think better of it, Ethan leaned forward, closing the distance between them. Their lips met, tentative at first, then with growing intensity. It was a collision of need and fear, of desire and the weight of their choices. When they finally pulled apart, both men were breathing heavily. Michael's hand lingered on Ethan's cheek, his thumb brushing lightly against his skin. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ethan nodded, though his mind was a chaotic mess. "I don't know what we're doing," he admitted. "Neither do I," Michael replied. "But I don't want to stop." The days that followed were a blur of stolen moments and whispered confessions. They navigated their new reality with a mix of caution and reckless abandon, careful not to leave any traces for Olivia to discover. One evening, as they sat on the patio under the cover of darkness, Michael reached for Ethan's hand. "I've never felt this way before," he said, his voice steady despite the vulnerability in his words. Ethan squeezed his hand, a small gesture that spoke volumes. "Me neither." But the weight of their actions was never far from Ethan's mind. Every glance from Olivia, every innocent touch between her and Michael, felt like a dagger to his heart. He knew their secret couldn't last, that the fragile bubble they had created would eventually burst. The breaking point came sooner than Ethan expected. Late one night, as he and Michael lingered in the kitchen after Olivia had gone to bed, their closeness became too much to ignore. Michael reached out, his fingers brushing against Ethan's. "I don't want this to end," he said, his voice filled with quiet desperation. Neither do I, Ethan admitted, his own fears momentarily eclipsed by the depth of his feelings. But as they leaned into each other, the sound of footsteps on the stairs sent them scrambling apart. Olivia appeared in the doorway, her eyes narrowing as she took in the scene. "What's going on?" she asked, her tone sharp with suspicion. Ethan's heart raced as Michael quickly stepped away, his expression carefully neutral. "Nothing," he said smoothly. "We were just talking." But the look in Olivia's eyes told Ethan she wasn't convinced. As she turned and walked away, he felt the walls of their fragile world begin to close in. That night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that their time was running out. The weight of their choices pressed heavily on his chest, a constant reminder of the inevitable fallout. And yet, even in the face of their impending doom, Ethan couldn't bring himself to regret what had happened. For the first time in his life, he had felt truly seen, truly desired. And that, he realized, was something worth holding on to no matter the cost. The summer sun hung low in the sky as Ethan pulled into the driveway of his Aunt Olivia's home. He had always admired this house, perched atop a quiet hill, exuding an air of comfort and success. It was a stark contrast to his own modest apartment in the city, a sanctuary he had retreated to in the past year as he tried to make sense of his life. Ethan wasn't entirely sure why he had accepted Olivia's invitation to stay for the summer. Maybe it was her warm insistence over the phone, the promise of family meals and lazy afternoons by the pool. Or perhaps it was his unspoken longing for connection, a reprieve from the loneliness that had settled around him like a heavy fog. When Olivia greeted him at the door, her smile was as radiant as ever. "Ethan," she exclaimed, pulling him into a tight hug. She smelled of lavender and vanilla, a comforting reminder of childhood visits. "It's so good to see you, Aunt Olivia," Ethan said, managing a small smile. He glanced behind her and saw Michael standing in the entryway, his tall frame leaning casually against the doorframe. Michael was everything Ethan remembered and more. His dark hair was neatly combed, his tailored shirt open at the collar, revealing a hint of tanned skin. He exuded a quiet confidence that seemed effortless, even magnetic. "Ethan," Michael said with a friendly smile, extending a hand. "It's been a while. Welcome." The handshake was firm, his hand warm against Ethan's. For a fleeting moment, their eyes met, and Ethan felt something stir within him, something he couldn't quite name. Over dinner that evening, the conversation flowed easily. Olivia recounted family stories with her characteristic flair, her laughter filling the room. Ethan found himself watching Michael, studying the way he listened intently to Olivia, the subtle lift of his lips when she said something amusing. Michael seemed so at ease, so composed, yet there was an intensity about him that made Ethan's chest tighten. As the days turned into weeks, Ethan settled into a rhythm. Mornings were spent lounging by the pool with a book, afternoons helping Olivia in the kitchen or running errands, and evenings often ended with the three of them on the patio, sipping wine and watching the stars. It was during one of these evenings that Ethan first noticed the shift. Olivia had excused herself early, leaving Ethan and Michael alone. The conversation turned personal, a bit more revealing than before. "You've grown up a lot since I last saw you," Michael said, his voice low and steady. "You seem different." Ethan looked down at his glass, swirling the wine. "Different how?" Michael hesitated, as if choosing his words carefully. "More confident, maybe. More sure of yourself." Ethan almost laughed. If only Michael knew the truth. The sleepless nights, the endless questioning of who he was and what he wanted. But instead, he said, "Thanks. I'm trying." Michael leaned back in his chair, his gaze lingering on Ethan a moment longer than necessary. "Trying suits you." The words hung in the air, their weight unmistakable. Ethan felt a flush rise to his cheeks and quickly excused himself, retreating to the safety of his room. The days that followed were marked by a growing awareness. Ethan found himself hyper-conscious of Michael's presence, his voice, his scent, the way his laughter filled the spaces between Olivia's chatter. He told himself it was admiration, a harmless fascination, but deep down, he knew it was more. It was during a late afternoon swim that the tension became undeniable. Olivia had gone to town, leaving Ethan and Michael alone by the pool. Ethan had just emerged from the water, droplets clinging to his skin, when he caught Michael watching him. "You're a good swimmer," Michael remarked, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. "Thanks," Ethan said, grabbing a towel. He tried to focus on drying off, but he could feel Michael's gaze, heavy and unyielding. "Do you ever stop and realize how much you've changed?" Michael's question caught Ethan off guard. Ethan looked up, meeting Michael's eyes. "What do you mean?" "You've become someone people notice," Michael said, his voice soft but deliberate. "Someone worth noticing." The words sent a jolt through Ethan. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. Instead, he turned away, his mind racing. That night, Ethan lay awake, replaying the moment by the pool. He tried to rationalize it, to convince himself it was nothing more than a compliment. But the way Michael had looked at him, the intensity, the unspoken understanding, it was impossible to ignore. The next morning, Ethan found himself avoiding Michael, keeping his interactions brief and distant. But by evening, the effort proved futile. Michael cornered him in the kitchen, his expression unreadable. "Have I done something to make you uncomfortable?" Michael asked, his voice low but firm. Ethan shook his head quickly. "No, of course not. I've just had a lot on my mind." Michael nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving Ethan's. "If there's ever anything you want to talk about, I'm here." The sincerity in Michael's voice was disarming, and for a moment, Ethan considered confiding in him. But the thought of voicing his feelings, of laying bare the turmoil within him, was too terrifying. "Thanks," Ethan managed, his voice barely above a whisper. Michael gave him a small smile before walking away, leaving Ethan alone with his thoughts. As the night wore on, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between them. The line they had both carefully towed was beginning to blur, and with it came a mix of exhilaration and dread. By the time he drifted off to sleep, one thing was clear: this summer would change everything. Ethan woke the next morning to an uneasy silence in the house. The usual clinking of dishes and Olivia's cheerful humming were absent. He sat up, his chest tight, as he replayed the events of the previous night. Olivia's questioning gaze had lingered far longer than he wanted to admit. Downstairs, he found Michael standing by the window, a mug of coffee in his hand. His posture was tense, his shoulders rigid as if bracing for an oncoming storm. "She knows," Michael said without turning around. His voice was low, resolute. Ethan swallowed hard, his heart sinking. "What do you mean?" "She hasn't said anything directly, but I can feel it. The way she looked at me this morning," he trailed off, finally glancing at Ethan. "We've crossed a line and she knows it." Ethan's stomach churned. He hadn't anticipated how quickly things would unravel, how exposed he would feel. "What do we do?" he asked, his voice trembling. Michael sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know, but I can't let this destroy her. She doesn't deserve that." Before Ethan could respond, Olivia walked into the room, her face pale and set with grim determination. She carried an air of calm that was more unnerving than any outburst could have been. "We need to talk," she said, her voice sharp and unwavering. The three of them sat in the living room, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. Olivia's eyes flicked between them, her expression a mixture of hurt and anger. "Do you think I'm stupid?" she began, her tone cutting. "Do you think I haven't noticed the way you two look at each other, the way you act when you think I'm not around?" Ethan opened his mouth to protest, but she held up a hand, silencing him. Don't insult me with denials." Michael leaned forward, his face etched with regret. "Olivia, Don't you dare," she interrupted, her voice trembling now. "Don't you dare try to explain this away. I trusted you, Michael. I brought Ethan into this house because I thought we were family, and this is how you repay me." The room fell silent, Olivia's words hanging in the air like a gavel strike. Ethan's chest tightened as guilt washed over him in waves. "Olivia, I'm so sorry," he said softly, his voice breaking. Her eyes turned to him, filled with a pain he couldn't bear to face. "You should be," she said, her tone cold. But sorry doesn't fix this. Sorry doesn't undo what you've done. Michael reached for her hand, but she pulled away, standing abruptly. I need time, she said, her voice steadier now. Time to figure out what's next for me, for us. But for now, Ethan, I think you should leave. The finality of her words hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. He nodded, unable to muster a response. Without another word, he stood and headed upstairs to pack his things, each step heavier than the last. The drive back to the city was agonizing. Ethan replayed every moment in his mind, dissecting each choice, each stolen glance, each kiss. The shame was suffocating, but so was the ache of leaving Michael behind. He thought about Olivia, her kindness, her warmth, and the trust he had so carelessly shattered. He had never intended to hurt her, but his intentions meant nothing in the face of the damage he had caused. For weeks, Ethan lived in a haze of regret and self-recrimination. He avoided Michael's calls, unable to face the reality of their actions. The weight of their affair hung over him like a dark cloud, a constant reminder of the line they had crossed. But slowly, as the days turned into weeks, Ethan began to confront his feelings. He thought about the emptiness he had felt before that summer, the yearning for connection that Michael had briefly filled. And while he couldn't condone what they had done, he couldn't deny the clarity it had given him. In the quiet of his apartment, Ethan began to write. At first, it was disjointed, fragments of thoughts and emotions he couldn't articulate aloud. But over time, it became a narrative, a way to process the chaos of his choices. He wrote about the intensity of his connection with Michael, the thrill and the guilt, the joy and the devastation. He wrote about Olivia, her betrayal, her heartbreak, and the strength she showed in demanding her own space. And he wrote about himself, the boy who had hidden his true self for so long, finally learning to face his own flaws and desires. One evening, months later, Ethan received a letter in the mail. The handwriting was unmistakably Michael's. He hesitated before opening it, bracing himself for whatever lay inside. The letter was brief, but it carried a weight Ethan hadn't anticipated. Ethan, I've spent a lot of time thinking about what happened, about us, about Olivia, about the choices we made. I don't regret knowing you, but I regret the pain we caused. Olivia has asked for a divorce. She deserves better, and I intend to give her the space to find it. I hope you find peace in all of this. For what it's worth, I'll always care about you. Michael. Ethan stared at the words, a mix of emotions swirling within him. He felt a pang of sadness for what might have been, but also a sense of closure. For the first time, he allowed himself to look forward, to imagine a future unburdened by secrets and lies. He wasn't sure what that future would hold, but he knew one thing: he wouldn't make the same mistakes again. That summer had changed him, in ways both painful and profound. And while he couldn't undo the past, he could choose how to move forward, carrying its lessons with him.